It's really nice to be able to be here to speak alongside a fabulous set of people, and I'm delighted that so many of you came out for this evening. The sort of theme for the session is around sort of design and ethnography, relationships between the two, and in particular in our sort of like discussions by emails, we were thinking about how to put it together. One of the notions that was sort of central was the future, and how the future or possible futures manifest themselves within the disciplines of design and the discipline of ethnography, and how we might want to sort of use the future as a way to think about a relationship between the two. Within sort of the domain of HCI for many years, there's been an interest in the use of ethnographic methods as a way of doing work in HCI, doing design-oriented work. And over the years, there's been a variety of ways in which we've interpreted what it is what the relationship might be between social science methods like ethnography and design practice in a digital domain. Trying to understand how we might use ethnography in support of design, either in advance of design to understand a setting, or after a design exercise in order to see what happens with that technology. There's been a variety too of ethnographic studies of the design process itself, of how designers work, how designers talk, how designers conceive of their users, and so forth. In some of the work that my group has done at Irvine, we've been thinking especially of a third kind of relationship, which is sort of ethnography through design, that is doing ethnographic work, but using design and design practice as a way of organizing, grappling with, putting together, coming to an understanding of ethnographic materials. The future is an interesting term then for us as to sort of think about an alternative way of conceptualizing a relationship between ethnography and design. And at first it might seem a little obvious perhaps, because as we think about ethnographic practice and social science and design practice, we might think that their relationships to temporalities are fairly given, that ethnography is largely about the present. Ethnographic methods through participant observation would seem to be ways primarily of understanding what's going on now, and maybe perhaps a little bit about what's happened in the past that brought us to our current circumstances, but by and large has not been thought of in anthropology traditionally as orienting towards the future. Sarah will probably say more about this, but Sarah's recent fabulous book on anthropological future sort of shakes that idea and shows us that ethnography might have a lot to say about the future, and anthropology might have a lot to say about the future that sort of disturbs our traditional idea. And I kind of want to think also about the way in which the future gets oriented within design. Because if ethnography would seem to be primarily about the present, design always inherently seems to be about the future. It's about producing effects in the future. It's about transforming current circumstances into new, different future arrangements. And so it would seem continually to be future-oriented. But what I want to sort of suggest is that if the relationship between ethnography and its temporal context is not quite as obvious as it might seem, then the relationship between design and its temporal context is similarly not quite so simple. Even as we talk about the future, it would seem we're frequently actually talking about the present and the past. And I was trying to think of a way to illustrate this and could find nothing more immediately compelling than looking at past visions of futures, and the fact that we were familiar with it, when we read these visions of, oh God, I'm going to get it wrong and someone's going to correct me, like early 22nd century life, I can't quite remember what century it's meant to be set in, we see that as the 60s, not unreasonably. And indeed, you can juxtapose that with more contemporary visions of exactly the same time period, which look so much more contemporary, right? The world has changed in terms of the kinds of fabrics that people will use and reimagine to be futuristic. So that's what's going on in here, and I want to think about it. Our visions of what is futuristic are deeply bound in our current circumstances and indeed in our recent pasts. So I want to sort of think about this design practice and design relationship in a more complicated way, or in a more, differently than simply thinking about design being oriented towards the future, because that very orientation towards the future reflects a temporal embedding in the present and the past. So what perhaps ethnography can help us with, and social science in general can help us with in understanding design and an orientation towards the future, is helping us to look at futures as empirically present objects. And I mean present both in the sense of sort of phenomenological presence, right here, right nowness, but also present in the sense of like part of a contemporary conversation. There are many futures that we discuss. There are futures that we bat about. There are futures that we imagine we're going to live in. There are futures that we imagine others are going to live in. There are futures that we can envision as possibilities, reachable through design and engineering practice. But those are futures that we are currently embodying and enacting. There are futures that are empirically present objects that we can perhaps gain some kind of purchase on. And so, as I was sort of thinking about this for today's presentation, I thought one of the useful ways into this might be some work that's been going on in science and technology studies over the last 10 to 15 years or so on what people like Harold van Lente and Mike Michael and others have called the sociology of expectations. And in what's going on here is that within science studies, people have tried to understand this idea of futures as empirically present objects, and suggested, again, many different kind of elements of the future, but one of them that they want to sort of look at that links future to the contemporary is this notion of expectations. Ideas that we have individually and collectively about things that may happen, that can happen. And within the sociology of expectations, people have sort of broken down and tried to sort of tease apart different ways that the future manifests itself in terms of a series of expectations and what it is that expectations do. So I want to just quickly point you to a few of these. The first, and this is sort of picking up especially on Harold van Lente's work, is what he describes as the dynamics of promises and requirements. That is, that an expectation that something is possible becomes, after a while, a requirement that something be done. One might imagine, let's see, the example that's sort of immediately coming to mind, since we are, about a month off likely the announcement of Apple's next round of iPhones, is the way in which press speculation that arises in the year before the iPhone is introduced about what the phone might be like, becomes then a demand that the phone be like that, such that any change to what people had conceived of as a possibility, any deviation from that becomes a problem for the manufacturer. There is famously, and this is comes from the Gartner group, this notion of the hype cycle. And the different kinds of ways in which we might at different points historically think about different kinds of expectations. The heightened expectation as of a promising new technology. This version of the graph is not labeled, but there's the peak of the hype peak, and then there's the trough of disillusionment. I can't remember the names they have for the various kind of parts of this, as we reset our expectations about what the future might be. But the point about this, of course, is that it's not simply a future that's speculated about, it's inactive, it's productive, it makes futures. Discussions of expectations make futures by driving design practice, driving engineering practice, driving the selection of, for instance, research proposals by the Australian Research Council or whatever, towards things that we all collectively anticipate and expect should be happening. So the dynamics of this are interesting, right? There's a temporality that we want to sort of look at in the way in which an expectation produces exactly what it is that it claims to be anticipating. And the work that it's doing and how that sort of changes over time is interesting here. So the future is not simply the future. It's not just one future, not even one amongst many, but at different kinds of moments our relationship to that future may be evolving. The second thing that I want to sort of point to from this work on the sociology of expectations, and you might sort of anticipate this if I was just talking about temporalities, the next thing I would typically talk about is spatialities, where futures happen. And I want to sort of talk about this in a couple of different dimensions. One is the geographical. That is, that our technological futures tend to be ones that are produced in particular kinds of places, in high-tech centers like Melbourne, like San Francisco, like Silicon Valley, like New York, and not so much in Laos, not so much in any number of other kinds of places, who are the recipients of futures and the recipient, and who are being formulated within a series of of expectations, but are not necessarily in a position to be able to shape and control those. So there's a geographical kind of aspect to the way in which different kinds of expectations are produced and move around in the world, are imported and transmitted from one place to another. There's similarly a sort of perhaps less geographical spatiality here, but a structural spatiality, how we think about the relationship of certain kinds of expectations to other dimensions, ethnicities, genders, sexualities. These are all, again, sort of like there are particular kinds of ways in which certain kinds of expectations become embedded in different kinds of places within our social structure. But one of the most interesting elements that the sociologists of expectations point to, and the reason that I am using this really actually dreadful stock image, as I put this up because it was nice and it was easily available, but it would be hard to come across a picture of science less accurate than this one. Even like the objects, the bottles and things like that are on the desk seem to be drawn from, they seem to have previously dressed the set for like a home decor thing. I mean, there's like canning jars there and stuff, I don't know. There's not really a lot of science going on in this picture. But one of them is the proximity to the centers of science itself and technology production. One of the really interesting observations, at least for me, one of the eye-opening observations in the sociology of expectations, is that there's a great deal more uncertainty about those expectations at the points of technology and knowledge production than there is in the world in general. By and large, you're going to read much more certain pronouncements about the future of artificial intelligence on the front page of your newspaper than you're going to hear from anybody who does AI research. The idea of the impacts of autonomous vehicles, again, play out in a public sphere in very different ways than they play out from the people driving cars around test tracks. And so a spatial differentiation of future expectations includes one that's driven by the proximity to the centers of power and the proximity to the centers of control and knowledge production as much as it does the geographical and the social structural. The third and last thing that I sort of want to point to, drawing from the sociology of expectations work, is what is sometimes called the pre-disciplining of the imagination. The idea that what expectations do, as they circulate in popular and scientific discourse, is they discipline us to understand certain limits upon what it is that we should imagine, hope for, or produce in our design work. It tells us what's going to happen and therefore tells us what it is that we ought to be doing. And it can be a vision that inspires, but also one that constrains. And perhaps one of the ways that this is most obvious is in the realm of sort of technology roadmaps. I've done a lot of work with a high-tech company that is highly driven by roadmaps, projected 5, 10 years into the future that anticipate the progress of their core technologies. And one of the things that's always been sort of kind of troublesome as an academic researcher trying to work with these people is that you basically can't do anything that isn't on the roadmap. The roadmap is driving what the company is going to be doing, but it drives it to such an extent that it becomes impossible to devote any resources to something that's off roadmap. This, by the way, is of course not simply restricted to high-tech companies. My university does exactly the same. Every school has to produce a 5-year plan, and you can never do anything that wasn't on the 5-year plan. Interestingly, no one ever checks if you've actually done the things that were on your 5-year plan. So that's why I sort of think, the interesting thing here is how these things constrain what it is that one does, perhaps more than inspire. So things like this, notions that we sort of draw here, might have something we can take back to thinking about ethnography and thinking about design. Certainly, they suggest a much more complicated relationship between design practice, its present, and its future, suggesting that where design might be imagined to be future-oriented and future-looking, it may in itself actually be looking much more at the present in order to find the resources for imagining and anticipating certain kinds of futures. It also, in terms of this conversation between design and ethnography, tells us something about what some of the value that ethnography can provide to us, particularly in terms of ethnography's reflexive stance and the requirement the demand essentially that ethnography makes, that we acknowledge something about our own subject positions, about where we come from and who we are as we speculate about futures. So I wanted to sort of throw these things out as a starting point perhaps for having some of that conversation. Thank you.